Everyone. I've been a complete nightmare to the AV team in the back, so I hope you'll forgive me if we're late today, if I go the long way to say hi to Chich, who has been so kind with previous research and in bringing me here. So thank you all for being with us this morning, for having me here. Chich did a great job of introducing me, certainly much better than I would have myself. So I'm really hoping my slides look good. There was a huge issue with sort of getting them formatted properly, so be kind about the pictures. It's all my fault. Everyone's been very kind back there. So today I want to talk about wartime CTI, an incredibly pretentious topic in some ways, but we already introed. You can't read it. It's fine. I'm over at SentinelOne. I am an adjunct at the Perovich Institute, and I am chronically oversubscribed, which is why I can't seem to get a slide deck done in time to save my life. But today we're going to talk about cyber threat intelligence. I would imagine most of you are familiar with CTI to some extent. However, I do think it's important for all of us to kind of share the same understanding of things. There are many definitions for CTI, some more pretentious, some more pragmatic, and I think we should try to at least get comfortable with all of them. So, of course, starting right at the beginning, it is very much a marketing term. That's fine. We need to acknowledge it. You need to acknowledge when it is something incredibly cheap and useless, and when it's something incredibly valuable and worth working on. So very much a marketing term, very much an RSA thing to try to sell you things you don't need. In some cases, we could say from a business standpoint, it is very much a justification for research teams, and that's important, right? Like when we talk about sort of marketing in terms of what it provides for CTI, and like we all hate on it, but frankly, that's what pays for a lot of the research teams that we see with, great 10 years ago all the way to now. It is in many ways a demonstration of elusive expertise. For those of you that already work in the industry, you already know this. For those of you that want to get more into the industry, the truth is that just doing something that's interesting and cool because it's interesting and cool doesn't seem to motivate a whole lot of executives, so you do have to give them some kind of business ROI. It is a premise for an expensive report subscription service. I'm sure some of you are customers of some of these, and I hope you're getting your money's worth, and if you're not, you probably wouldn't know. But getting to the less cynical side of things, what it's really meant to be is essentially a form of cyber situational awareness, right? It's a contribution to intelligence writ large as much as we can try to do that, and in that, a hedge against information asymmetry. And information asymmetry is a really important concept in cybersecurity because it's really the heart of what we're working on, what we fail at, what we're trying to accomplish, which is to say, I want to know what our enemies know, what they're doing, what they're preparing, how they're acting, and I don't want them to know the things that I know. And that's really the game in its simplest terms. CTI is meant to be a hedge against that and say, well, we can tell you more or less what we think we know, what these actors are doing elsewhere, what they might do to you, and so on. In some ways, I think we also need to be very honest with ourselves. From a business perspective, it's a very sly way for companies that don't want to deal with geopolitical risks, who don't want to have skin in the game and actually take a stand and have to say, oh, we like this country better than the other, or we're involved in this way or the other, in an uncomfortable conflict, to still be able to do it, to still be able to provide something that the public sector is interested in, many governments are interested in, and many customers are interested in, without having to say even the names of countries, right? That's why we have this like ridiculous menagerie of names, some of which I contribute to with great relish, and others that I will judge, much like the new Mystic naming convention. I'm sorry. Anyways, we'll talk about it later. Now, the development of CTI is frankly uneven. The reason for that is in the public sector, folks like Chich and his folks have been doing amazing things in what you might consider cyber threat intelligence for a very long time. A lot of us didn't have the pleasure of doing CTI there or starting there in any way. We came in the private sector and sort of tried to build CTI in a way that is frankly unaware. Private sector CTI is reaching its teens. It's only been around for charitable 10 years, really, and it shows, right? It really was more of an unintended subset of malware analysis, right? A bunch of us nerds just sort of doing malware analysis, and from one day to the next, we find ourselves in the middle of, this great intelligence game, and we were no more equipped for it that day than the day before. We certainly don't seem to be that much better equipped for it now. So the provenance makes it unself-aware and often very immature. I would even say uneven in development across the industry. 8 years ago, I wrote this paper called The Ethics and Perils of APT Research, or really intelligence brokerage. And I think the main point was just to say, hey folks, the job isn't what we thought it was before. If you are going to say that you sell cyber threat intelligence, if you produce and promulgate cyber threat intelligence, that you should probably get comfortable with the idea that you are in some form an intelligence broker. In many ways, this talk is kind of a direct descendant of that paper. The paper, despite its promise, primarily focused on the perils of doing APT research. It was something we kind of had to talk to ourselves, sort of what we've gotten ourselves involved in. And now we're forced to actually talk about the ethics of it. And that's really where we kind of tie into the premise of this keynote, which is to say, what is the moral and ethical valence of the operations that we disrupt? And by corollary, what is the moral and ethical valence of the work that we do? For the sticklers in the room, by which I mean if anybody did PPE or like political philosophy, we're going to use morals and ethics interchangeably. It's fine. It doesn't matter. I'm going to stop here and just say, I know this keynote was sold as a kind of topical discussion on the role of CTI in wartime, and we all want to talk about Ukraine and Israel and eventually Taiwan. And it is, but the primary difference between CTI and peace and war is actually our ability to comfortably abstain from questions of ethics. Ethical questions are uncomfortable. There's a reason that businesses don't really want to discuss them openly, and we seldom discuss them even when we're on our own, even when we're having drinks. Nobody really wants to be forced to sort of consider the impact of their contributions. Because in many ways it means that you kind of own some portion of those outcomes. Let's not make ourselves sound overly important. It doesn't mean we really have that much of an outsized impact, but we have some impact. You kind of have to face that. You have to own that. So in many ways, we've come up with all sorts of moral shorthands. The old maxim, at least back in the days when great was great, was malware is malware, right? Doesn't matter. We just, whatever we find, we're going to publish on, we're going to work on, we're going to track everybody. And in some ways, I think there's something legitimate to that, right? You're doing CTI. It's supposed to be some form of situational awareness that everybody can rely on. You should probably not pre-filter what you work on and what you look at. Alternatively, and this is the one that kind of got me in the most trouble as an American in America, researching American APTs for some time, it's a sort of like patriotic sense where you go, well, we just don't look at friendly operations. Cool. Doesn't seem to keep people from selling to other countries, but look, I don't actually have a serious objection to it other than a methodological one. But I would say, even in that stance, right, it hasn't kept anybody who sells CTI and may refuse to look at US APTs or UK-based APTs or whatever from selling to the Belgians or to whomever else. So there are definitely some more surface ethical discussions we might want to have as a business. I would also suggest that in a space where attribution is actually a non-trivial problem, how well can you actually spot your friends? This used to get kind of laughed out of the room 8 years ago. Post-Shadow Brokers, Vault 7, et cetera, et cetera. Somehow not that difficult a concept. And in what was not intended to be very tiny font, I'd say, shadow brokers or Vault 7, Vault 8 showing up in places where it wasn't supposed to, at times where it wasn't supposed to, or BEMSTOR, if you remember, repurposing a version of double pulsar that was never leaked. Same with some exploits, both by the Chinese and by others. Or, these Western devs who seem to leave the intelligence community and find themselves in the UAE or other wonderful places doing wonderful work they weren't intended to. Or really, entirely unidentified threat actors that seem to find themselves at important victim junctures. You might assume that they are who we want them to be, but we are just assuming. So perhaps deconfliction shouldn't be entirely vibes-based, right? Alternatively, maybe this is where I need to start atoning for my sins, and we can treat this as a sort of like Threat Researchers Anonymous meeting, in which case I'll say, hello, my name is JAGS. It's probably been about a year since the last time I've openly burned a friendly operation, and you would say, thank you. Thank you so much. So less facetiously, I will say, at this point, I guess I'm getting old enough where I have the pleasure of, or the honor of, mentoring a couple of folks, and a really brilliant newcomer on the scene asked me not too long ago, she goes, why do you hunt good guys? And frankly, I had no intention of dodging the question, but I have to object to the framing of it, right? That's not what I do. It's not exclusively what I've done. But there is something for us to discuss there. Putting aside questions of intellectual honesty or historical responsibility as to what we're doing, how can we actually be an effective hedge against information asymmetry if we blind ourselves at the faintest indication of friendly provenance? Keep this in mind, right? I'm not talking about someone waving a flag of your own country saying, hey, this is me, please go away. That's a very different conversation than saying, hey, I ran into an APT. It kind of smells like something from home. Attribution should be more complicated than that. And frankly, there's nothing wrong with looking at the thing. You look, you investigate, and then you get to choose what to do with the information. And that's where the ethics kind of comes right back into the space. That's what we kind of want to deprive ourselves of by having these maxims that we can just sort of rely on without having to think and without having to own the outcomes of what happens. I think there's another part of this, which is that the intelligence game has evolved in ways that folks were not prepared for. And the intelligence community globally, writ large, has to get out of its own way. They're going to have to figure out how to deal with us as a semi-novel, but actually permanent part of the modern intelligence dynamic. We're in it, we're in the middle of it. Use it to your advantage, but we're not going away. And it shouldn't be an entirely bitter pill to swallow in some ways, because if we look at the recent conflicts, particularly recent wars, it turns out that the IC needs a great deal from the tech sector in general and the CTI industry in particular. You would be surprised how little coordination or awareness that there actually has been as to how we should be prioritizing things. For example, for the Israeli-Hamas war, which caught everybody flat-footed, some folks that you would hope it would not. So with that range of choices and motivations and actions in mind, I think we do well to acknowledge some of the following complexities in this space. There is purpose and value to the operations that we investigate, which is to say, cyber espionage, cyber sabotage, they actually play meaningful roles in geopolitics and international relations. There's a reason that billions are invested into these capabilities globally. I think we have kind of deluded ourselves otherwise by focusing on the illegitimate edge cases and extrapolating from there. So, they hit some journalists, they hit activists, this is sort of this democracy effacing, national sovereignty weakening activity. In many cases it is, but those are very much a subset of edge cases. They're not actually the whole of what cyber espionage is supposed to be. And I think that should provide you with a metric for where the faulty reasoning really comes in, which is any time that we're dealing with moral absolutism or some kind of categorical defeatism, by which I mean, when you see those tweets that go, well, actually, InfoSec doesn't do anything and CTI hasn't meaningfully contributed to anything at any point. Look, I'm not going to pretend we're the most important part of anything at all, but to say that it plays no role, I think says more about where some of these people sit rather than what the activity itself is. So I think that's where our ethical shorthands have just kind of gotten out of hand. And for any Wittgensteinians in the room, we can talk later on. I think you can get away with a lot of navel-gazing at peacetime. When I wrote the paper in 2015, there wasn't much of a discussion about ethics. It was almost entirely about the perils of being, one of the nerds who did malware analysis who suddenly found himself between two intelligence agencies and, was sort of out of place. We didn't really have to talk about the effects that we were having on the world by virtue of burning certain capabilities. And that's why I want to talk about this sort of in the frame of wartime. Our thinking has had to evolve. My ignorance has had to really present itself. Precisely because the calculus changes so much when there are lives on the line and there's folks actually trying to rewrite maps. So I think we generally admit that there are classes of targeted operations that we agree with, right? Your typical ones, going after child pornographers and human traffickers and there's, terrorists, et cetera. Everybody seems to be okay with certain edge cases as long as it's targeted operations. And even here, I think we kind of betray some of these oversimplifications in the moral calculus, right? Are we saying, when we talk about burning ops by the Chinese or the Russians or North Koreans or whomever it is that you don't like, probably for good reasons, are we really saying that these institutions have never run a legitimate operation? They have never gone after someone that you would think is a legitimate target? I think that says more about how we're trying to think about this. That is what we're consistently implying with some of these things. And I think if anybody who's really done CTI for the past 10 years is completely honest about some of the APTs they've looked at and has actually looked at victimology in depth, it's never that clear-cut. Never. Sophacy, Fancy Bear, APT-28, whatever the hell you want to call them, they used to be known for doing counterterrorism work in the Balkans and Eastern Europe back in 2008, 2009. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with going after them, it's just not that simple. There's also parameters that we've tried to push upon responsible nations. Not everybody listens to what we have to say. Most people don't listen to what we have to say. But for example, if you remember sort of like the age of Snowden hysteria, we really made this massive point about Dragnet collection is unacceptable, mass surveillance unacceptable, so it has to be targeted operations. Okay, I don't know that we're sending the same message anymore. I think now we're just saying no operations are okay, and obviously that's not going to work for anybody. Similarly, I think a lot of the threat researchers that were involved in the 2012, 2014, 15 era, we made a big point of saying, please, for the love of Christ, especially those of us that work in the AV industry at the time, we really only have a binary choice. You either detect and burn a whole platform or you don't. So please, could you just segment some of what you use? Use your, weaker, shittier tooling that you don't mind losing to track the folks that we would all agree with tracking. It was an attempt. I think some nations actually took it on, most did not. And we do that because our actions do have a meaning and they do have an effect. We often limit visibility at a time of our choosing, not theirs. We disable entire capabilities indiscriminately. So whole platforms, multi-million-dollar platforms that have been built over. I mean, Chich mentioned Moonlight Maze going into Turla. That's 20-some years of Russian ops. Similarly, League of Titans, right? The Russians were doing that since '96. And so was the Equation Group, as far as we can tell, of 1995. So you're talking about things that have been going on for a very, very long time. We often force these costly retoolings with great relish. I don't know how much money most countries have to keep doing that, but we do. and we force the abandonment of entire avenues of collection. If you really understand how certain forms of like special access can work, you don't just get to go, well, we lost this one, we're just going to replace it with the next one. It's not quite like that. Ultimately, I think the biggest issue is we end up alerting and notifying victims of their selection as targets. That is our job. That is what we're supposed to be doing. It is fine. But in some cases, it does make certain types of work harder, and some of that work you may actually agree with. So we change their defensive posture sometimes. If any of you have had customers in certain regions, like the Middle East, you'll find that some people don't seem to care, but others do. I think a clearer example of this sort of thinking is actually sort of this paradoxical defense side debate around 0 days and the burning of 0 days. Somehow, we entertain both of these thoughts at the same time. We're improving everyone's defense by patching this actively exploited in the wild O-Day. And at the same time, we go, well, we're not really limiting the ability of law enforcement, of the intelligence community to track legitimate threats because they can just replace it with a different 0 day and keep going. Take a minute to just bask in the logic of that, right? It doesn't add up. It's not to say that all agencies are good or that we're bad for standing in their way. That is not the point. We're doing what we should be doing. It's actually to disabuse us of like really convenient oversimplifications that we use to abstain from moral encumbrance. The whole point of it is you're supposed to be uncomfortable. That's what makes important choices matter. That's what makes them difficult. That's what makes human life intricate. I will say that these were the mechanisms of peacetime. Our nascent pursuit could afford to give itself the sort of like luxury of navel gazing and the sort of academic abstraction where you go, well, we just want to understand what everybody's doing. And in many ways, we still have to. It's just harder now. You kind of have to face it. And if we're honest with ourselves, the motives of our industry can really vary, right? At best, they're blended. Charitably, they're varied. At worst, they're absolutely banal, right? Like the whole marketing thing and being able to have, action figures and this like posters of what glorified threat actors should look like. Let's not pretend that that's actually being done for good reasons. The CTI industry is currently primarily fueled by marketing value and brand awareness. And before you go to condemn that entirely, I ask you, what other financial dynamic is supposed to pay for this? Because subscription services are not great either, right? Like back in the day, for those of you that were reading sort of all these blogs and reports about these big threat actors in 2012, 13, 14, it was all public. Everything was being published. And you could go on Twitter and say, you're an idiot, you forgot this, and you messed this up, and your rule sucks, and like this is how you should fix the thing. That doesn't happen when someone sells you a subscription service for 6 figures under NDA, and you just have to suck it up if it sucks, or just not know if it's any good or bad, because you have nothing to compare against. So I do think that as researchers, not as product peddlers, our motivations are generally quite academic-ish. We also just want to look cool, right? We are documenting meaningful aspects of geopolitics that are otherwise entirely unknowable. It is this sort of like new incursion of humankind into this whole different area. I don't want to call it a domain anymore because I've been objecting to a lot of sort of like the military provenance of some of our concepts. In a closing keynote in this room for a different conference 4 weeks ago. So I've been doing plenty of bitching on this stage. So in a way, we're exploring these sort of notable interactions between states that have non-trivial trickle-down consequences. For anybody who's really into intelligence and intelligence history, what I'm talking about is precisely how little of what we know of intelligence operations over the past, 100 years ever actually makes it into historical accounts of how countries interacted with each other, how things unfolded. We have both stories. They never seem to intersect. It's worse so in cyber when you go, well, the only thing we know about this operation is some crummy blog that somebody put out with only half of the information in it, none of the victimology in it, and that's the only thing that's going to go into like the record of history. It's actually kind of nauseating in some ways. And then, of course, let's not forget, right? There's this sort of truly defensive sense where there is a value to giving mature customers and organizations rules and IOCs and a sense of what threat actors do. And when you go, yeah, we've been targeted by APT29 in the past, you go, well, this is what they do now. There is a meaningful interaction there. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? So I promised that I would end 10 minutes earlier since we started a bit late. My fault. So let me kind of wrap this up relatively quickly, right? What is our role in wartime? The Ukraine-Russia war showed us a lot. It showed us a lot of what we can serve. It showed us a lot what we're doing wrong, what we're doing right, and hopefully there are things that we've learned, though in some cases that doesn't seem to be the case. Honestly, we can and should serve as a non-trivial bulwark against asymmetrical threats. There is a purpose to serving as a sort of like reserve analytical force outside of the conflict. When you are faced with the immediacy of war, that isn't the best time for your analysts to go figure out just what every threat actor is doing and every kind of collection on you and every possibility of sabotage. And the truth is that you can't and you won't. And I mean, the Ukrainians were brilliant in using CERT-UA as this mechanism to just sort of toss spaghetti at the wall and go, if anybody has time, if anybody cares, and the industry responded. I'm actually quite proud. I think since the Stuxnet days, we haven't seen the CTI industry really come together and collaborate and not have that much ego. It's impossible to not have any, but be able to collaborate with each other in some meaningful ways. And frankly, there is a lot that happens that is not immediately, viscerally relevant to a conflict that does matter. There's new sabotage capabilities. If you look at things like InDestroyer or InController that haven't been used in the wild that suddenly get shown to the rest of the world to handle. You've got proxy force projection, which is becoming much more important in the Israeli-Hamas war, but that was important in the Russia-Ukraine conflict when we start to see, hey, Belarus is also starting to play a role in this, and you're also seeing the Chinese starting to ramp up operations that we haven't seen for 10 years all of a sudden in the context of Ukraine and Russia. There are things that are happening there that you cannot expect the victim that is fighting for their lives to take care of. And in some cases, there are things that they're just incapable of reaching. Like, if you're getting DDoSed in some meaningful way, right? Like, DDoSing a website is, who cares? But if someone is using a capability to actually take down your internet connection, there's things that Microsoft and Cloudflare and Google and other companies can do that you cannot expect any country to do by themselves in some ways. So we really shouldn't forget why these things matter. Frankly, we shouldn't forget that these things matter. I was hoping that we wouldn't have to have this argument, but looking at Twitter, it turns out that we do. And the truth is that we get to do, from the comfort of our keyboards, things that people have in the past given their lives or currently give their lives for, whether it's data collection or staving off sabotage or keeping collection efforts from fueling actual physical attacks in war. There's a lot of things that do matter that people can choose to get involved in. And frankly, I can promise you that the Israeli-Hamas war is going to be at least more intricate as a cyber-supported conflict by miles. I mean, the Russia-Ukraine one was very interesting, but you're also talking about this sort of 6 against 1 kind of conflict when it comes to Israel-Hamas or by proxy Iran. And we have seen some of the most interesting sabotage operations going both ways over the past 2 years in ways that we haven't talked about at all because we've been busy with Ukraine-Russia. That picture was supposed to look much nicer. But yes, you can look at something. If you haven't, look at Meteor Express or Predatory Sparrow or Gozhenske Daran or Adalat Alley over the past 2 years, and you can see what the first ever genuine cyber signaling operation looks like. I don't think we've ever seen it before. So as we enter the second of our 3 immediate cyber-supported hot conflicts. I really hope that you'll kind of embrace the true weight and value of your role as security researchers, whether aspiring or currently engaged. There is some point to being kind of authentic to yourselves, perhaps in a Heideggerian sense. And perhaps the best message is just to kind of learn to manage your overzealous corporate lawyers. We are living in a time when there is zero risk to doing nothing, and infinite risk to doing something, and that seems to be enough to keep a lot of people from doing anything. So I like to think that all of you can know sort of where you want to place yourselves and that you feel that you have the license to do so. And with a very terribly formatted picture, I'll say thank you, and as always, happy hunting. All right. I think we're right at time, so I'm going to step off, and if people want to have questions or talk later, I'd be happy to talk. Thank you.
Cool. Well, thank you.